Nearly 7 miles below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in total darkness, under pressure that would crush a car like an empty soda can, a camera just recorded something moving. Not drifting. Not sinking. Moving with purpose. And that single detail is rewriting what scientists thought was possible at the bottom of the world. To understand why this matters, you have to understand just how hostile this place really is. At 10,900 meters down, in a place called Challenger Deep, the deepest point of the Mariana Trench, the water pressure is more than 1,000 times what we feel at sea level. Imagine the weight of 50 jumbo jets pressing down on a single person. That is the environment at the bottom of this trench. No sunlight has ever touched this water. Temperatures hover just a few degrees above freezing. For most of the 20th century, scientists assumed this depth was simply too extreme to support life of any real complexity. It was labeled, almost officially, a biological desert. That assumption held for decades because almost nobody could actually check it. Only a tiny handful of missions have ever reached the very bottom of the Mariana Trench, and each one changed what we thought we knew. The first descent happened back in 1960, when Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh rowed a vessel called the Trieste down to the bottom. It wasn't built like a modern submarine. It used gasoline for buoyancy and iron pellets as ballast, more like a controlled free-fall capsule than an exploration craft. Their entire trip to the bottom and back took hours, and once they arrived, they only had about 20 minutes before they had to start the return. Worse, their own descent stirred up a cloud of seafloor sediment that clouded their tiny viewport. Through the murk, they reported seeing what looked like a flatfish resting on the bottom. Some scientists took that as proof of life at extreme depth. Others argued it might have simply been a sea cucumber, or nothing at all. The observation was too brief and the visibility too poor to settle the debate, and after that mission, no human being returned to the very bottom of the trench for more than 50 years. During that gap, the idea of the Hadal zone, the deepest layer of ocean below 6,000 meters, hardened into scientific consensus. Textbooks described it as nearly lifeless. The logic seemed sound. Sunlight never reaches these depths, so there's no photosynthesis to build a food web from scratch. Whatever organic material drifts down from the surface should theoretically be consumed by fish, crustaceans, and bacteria long before it falls the 7 miles required to reach the bottom. By that logic, the deepest parts of the ocean should be closer to a lifeless desert than a living ecosystem. The problem is that this consensus was built almost entirely on absence of evidence, not evidence itself. Nobody had the tools to actually check, so the assumption simply went unchallenged for generations. That changed with an invention that didn't require a human being to survive the trip at all, the deep-sea lander. The concept is deceptively simple. Engineers built weighted frames carrying cameras, lights, and bait, designed to sink to the seafloor under their own weight. Once they settle on the bottom, they simply record whatever swims into view. After a set number of hours, a mechanism releases the ballast weights, and the lander floats back up to the surface carrying its footage. No human needs to descend, no vessel needs to survive crushing pressure with a person inside it. The lander does the dangerous part alone. Researchers, led by scientists like Alan Jameson, began dropping these landers into trenches around the world, including the Mariana Trench, the Kermadec Trench, and the Japan Trench. What came back on those memory cards did not match the textbooks at all. Within hours of a lander touching down, amphipods started to arrive. These are small, shrimp-like scavengers, and in this new footage they didn't behave like animals barely clinging to survival. They swarmed the bait aggressively, competing with each other, feeding in dense, active clusters that looked more like a shallow water feeding frenzy than anything from a supposed wasteland. Sometimes dozens, sometimes what looked like hundreds of them converged at once, drawn in by chemical signals in the water, fighting over the food source until the seafloor beneath them was barely visible under the mass of feeding bodies. That alone forced a re-evaluation. But the discovery that really broke the old assumptions came a few years later, when cameras captured a small, pale, almost translucent fish swimming with total ease at roughly 8,100 meters down. This was the Mariana snailfish, and its existence was a genuine problem for biologists, because the scientific consensus at the time held that fish simply could not survive much beyond 8,000 meters. The reasoning wasn't guesswork. Extreme pressure damages proteins and disrupts cell membranes at a molecular level, and researchers believed there was a hard physiological ceiling that vertebrate fish could not cross. The snailfish crossed it anyway, and it wasn't struggling to do so. It was hunting normally, moving normally, living exactly the way a fish should live, just 7.5 kilometers below the sunlight. The explanation turned out to lie in a compound called TMAO, or trimethylamine N-oxide, which helps stabilize proteins under extreme pressure and counteracts the damage that would otherwise cripple cellular function. The Mariana snailfish carries unusually high concentrations of it. Evolution had quietly solved a problem that biologists had assumed was unsolvable. Even TMAO has its limits, though. Past a certain concentration, it becomes toxic to the very cells it's meant to protect, which is likely why snailfish appear to top out somewhere around 8,200 to 8,400 meters. Beyond that threshold, fish biology simply cannot follow, and the deepest layers of the trench belong to other kinds of organisms entirely, invertebrates, single-celled giants, and microbial life built on entirely different biochemistry. And the deeper the cameras went, the stranger the footage became. Researchers recorded sea cucumbers slowly moving across the sediment, feeding on organic particles that had drifted down over months or years. They found polychaete worms burrowing through mud under pressure that would instantly destroy a surface-dwelling organism. They documented enormous single-celled organisms called xenophyrophores, amoeba-like life forms that grow large enough to see with the naked eye and build strange structures on the seafloor that look almost architectural. In some regions, thick microbial mats covered the sediment entirely, communities of bacteria and archaea running chemical processes that have nothing to do with sunlight at all. Some of the organisms captured on camera didn't fit neatly into any known category, which raises the very real possibility that entire branches of Hadal zone life remain unclassified, known only from a few seconds of footage shot in total darkness. What the footage revealed wasn't just isolated survivors either. It showed structure. Different species occupying different ecological niches, predators, scavengers, and decomposers all interacting, competing, and coexisting. In other words, a functioning ecosystem, in a place ecosystems were never supposed to exist. Which brings us to the real mystery: if there's no sunlight and barely any food reaching this depth, how does any of this work? On the surface, the entire ocean food web ultimately traces back to sunlight. Phytoplankton photosynthesize, zooplankton eat them, small fish eat the zooplankton, and so on up the chain. At 10,900 meters, none of that applies. The only nutrition reaching the Hadal zone is whatever organic material sinks down from above, sometimes called marine snow, and for a long time researchers assumed that almost none of it would survive the 7-mile journey without being consumed along the way. The current thinking is that a few overlapping factors explain the abundance scientists are now seeing. Large food falls, like a whale carcass, can sink to the bottom fast enough that a meaningful amount of organic material survives the trip intact, delivering an enormous, if occasional, pulse of nutrition that can sustain scavenger communities for a long time afterward. The physical shape of a trench may also work like a funnel, concentrating whatever organic debris drifts down from a huge surface area into a comparatively narrow channel at the bottom, effectively collecting food rather than dispersing it. And in some regions, chemosynthesis may add another food source entirely, with microbes deriving energy directly from chemical reactions involving compounds like hydrogen sulfide and methane, building organic matter without any input from the sun at all. Put together, these factors start to explain how what looked like a lifeless desert turns out to be a functioning, if unconventional, ecosystem. Human exploration of Challenger Deep has continued in the years since those early lander missions, each descent adding a new piece to the picture. In 2012, filmmaker James Cameron piloted a solo submersible called the Deep-Sea Challenger to the bottom, spending several hours filming and exploring before ascending again. His footage showed a largely flat, sandy seafloor in his specific landing area, along with amphipods and microbial mats, evidence that even seemingly barren patches of the trench still support biological activity. In 2019, explorer Victor Vescovo went even further, making multiple dives to Challenger Deep in the submersible limiting factor, as part of an expedition to reach the deepest point in each of the world's oceans. His dives produced some of the most detailed footage ever captured at that depth, documenting seafloor organisms in greater detail than any previous mission. But his cameras also recorded something nobody wanted to find: a plastic bag, and what appeared to be candy wrapper debris, resting undisturbed on the sediment at the absolute bottom of the ocean. Later analysis of Hadal amphipods found microplastics already present in their digestive systems, meaning human pollution has already reached, and already been ingested by, life at the deepest point on Earth, a place almost no human being has ever physically visited. The implications of all this reach far beyond our own planet, too. Scientists studying moons like Europa and Enceladus have found strong evidence of liquid oceans hidden beneath thick shells of ice, environments that are dark, cold, and under enormous pressure, not unlike the Hadal Zone right here on Earth. Every organism discovered thriving in the Mariana Trench adds weight to the idea that life may be able to survive in conditions that once seemed impossible, whether that's 7 miles beneath the Pacific or under the ice of a distant moon. There's also a more immediate, practical value to all of this. The organisms living in the Hadal Zone have evolved proteins, enzymes, and cell membranes that continue functioning under pressures that would destroy ordinary biological structures. Researchers are already studying whether these pressure-resistant adaptations could inspire new approaches in medicine, industrial chemistry, or biotechnology, since evolution has effectively been running pressure experiments in these trenches for millions of years, long before any human laboratory existed. Even with everything learned so far, scientists estimate that less than 5% of the deep ocean has actually been explored in any real detail. Every expedition into the Hadal Zone tends to turn up something that doesn't match the textbooks, whether that's an unclassified organism, an unexpected behavior, or evidence of an ecosystem functioning in a way nobody predicted. The consensus that once painted the ocean floor as an empty, lifeless plain wasn't built on solid observation. It was built on the absence of it, and every new camera that descends into that darkness keeps proving how wrong that old assumption really was. Something is still down there right now, moving through total darkness, under crushing pressure, in near-freezing water, exactly as it has been for longer than humans have existed on this planet. We are the ones who just started paying attention. And based on everything the last few decades of footage have shown us, the deepest ocean on Earth still has far more to reveal than it's given up so far.